At my wife's funeral, my daughter-in-law leaned over the grave, smiled at me, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Take your spot in line, Harold. You're next." Everyone laughed. My own son laughed. I didn't say a word. But 3 days later, I found a note in my jacket pocket. My wife's last gift to me. And what it said would bring my daughter-in-law to her knees on my porch in the rain, begging for forgiveness within a month. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. The cemetery was still wet from the morning rain when my daughter-in-law leaned into the open grave, smiled at me like we were sharing a joke, and said loud enough for the whole back row to hear, "Take your spot in line, Harold. You're next." My son Andrew laughed. 2 cousins I barely recognized laughed. A woman from the neighborhood covered her mouth, but her eyes were already smiling. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I just stood there at Magnolia Cemetery in Charleston, holding a small brass compass in my right hand, and I committed every single face in that half circle to memory. That's the one thing I'll admit about myself at 68. I forget where I put my reading glasses twice a day, but I don't forget who laughed at me while my wife was being lowered into the ground. My name is Harold Bishop. I was born here, raised here, and I ran Bishop Freight and Cargo out of a warehouse off Morrison Drive for 31 years before I sold it in 2019. I live in an old pastel house on Trad Street, south of Broad, with creaky floors and a porch that catches every breeze off the harbor. My wife and I were together 43 years. I'm not going to talk about her the way some men do, like she's a saint painted on a wall. She was sharp. She read people faster than anyone I ever met. And she'd been gone exactly 90 minutes when Brittany decided to try her little comedy routine. Brittany is my son Andrew's wife. She's 34, works as a realtor in Mount Pleasant, and the only time I've seen her cry in 10 years was when Andrew bought her a used Acura instead of the Lexus she wanted. She wore a black dress to the funeral that belonged more on a nightclub patio than a graveside. Her heels sank 2 inches into the grass, and she kept tugging them out like she was irritated the cemetery hadn't paved itself for her. My son Andrew is 38. He's failed at 3 businesses, blamed 3 different partners, and asked me for money exactly 22 times since 2020. I keep count. It's a hobby of mine, along with the compasses. When Brittany hugged me at the graveside, she pressed herself against my shoulder, long enough for the neighbors to see how caring she was, then pulled back and delivered her little punchline. Andrew snorted. His cousin Jeremy, who I haven't spoken to in 6 years because he still owes me $1,000, laughed like it was the best joke he'd heard all week. My older son, William, who flew in from Norfolk with his 2 children, stepped forward and put his hand on my arm. William is 42, a combat veteran turned civil engineer, and he doesn't waste words. He just said quietly, "Dad, come on, let's go sit." Pastor Gorman finished the last prayer. I dropped a small handful of Charleston dirt on the casket, and I walked back to the black car with my back straight, because I was raised that way and because nothing feeds vultures faster than the smell of a man who's been hit. Back at the Trad Street house, the reception was the usual south of Broad Circus. Casseroles stacked 3 high. People I barely knew telling me how much they loved her. Brittany floating through the rooms like she was hosting a gallery opening, touching elbows and refilling wine glasses like the house already belonged to her. An hour in, Andrew pulled me aside near the staircase. He had that sheepish look he's used on me since he was 9 years old, the one that used to work. "Dad," he said, "I hate bringing this up today, but the timing is actually kind of perfect. I've got a real opportunity, a logistics consulting thing. I just need a bridge loan, $40,000. You'll have it back in 6 months, I swear on everything." I looked at my son. I looked at his wife across the room, who was watching us in the mirror above the fireplace with a small, satisfied smile. I looked at the brass compass still in my palm, which I'd been carrying since the cemetery, because I couldn't bring myself to put it down. "Let me think about it, son," I said. "Dad, it's 40 grand. You've got it sitting there doing nothing." I said I'd think about it. His jaw tightened. He walked away without another word. That was the first real crack I saw in the mask that afternoon, and I filed it away with the faces from the graveside. After the last guest left, around 9 at night, I went upstairs to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. My wife's closet was still open. Her blue cardigan was folded on the chair the way she always left it. I picked up the black funeral blazer I'd been wearing. It was hers, actually, a man's cut she'd bought me for an anniversary. And I reached into the inside breast pocket, out of habit. There was a folded piece of paper in there. I unfolded it slowly. Her handwriting, small, tilted, the way she wrote grocery lists and recipes. It said, "Check Brittany's mother's accounts. Something is wrong." E. I read it 3 times. I sat on the edge of the bed holding that piece of paper, and I didn't move for a long time. Outside, a horse carriage clopped down Trad Street. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 10. Brittany's mother had been dead for almost 3 years. 3 nights passed, and I didn't sleep. I'd drift for 40 minutes and come awake hearing her voice at the graveside. "Take your spot in line, Harold." Then my eyes would open, and I'd read the note again in my head, word for word. I kept drifting back to a memory from about 8 years ago, before Brittany was in the picture. Andrew had just started his second failed company, something about organic pet food. He came over for Sunday dinner, so nervous his hands shook when he picked up the fork. After dessert, my wife put her hand on his wrist and said, "Andy, it's okay to fail. Just don't lie to us about how." And he cried a little at the table, and I thought, all right, the boy's still in there. The boy will come back. The boy did not come back. Brittany happened, and the boy who cried at our table at 30 became a man who snorted at his mother's graveside at 38. I kept trying to pinpoint the moment, the specific Thanksgiving or Christmas where the gear stripped. I couldn't find it. That's what bothered me most, lying awake those 3 nights. That kind of change doesn't happen by accident. Somebody builds it, day by day, conversation by conversation. The morning of the 4th day, I got up at 6, shaved properly for the first time since the funeral, put on a gray suit, and drove downtown to the office of Gregory Marshall. Gregory has handled our legal work since 2008. His office is on the 2nd floor of an old brick building on Broad Street, the kind with slow wooden stairs and a secretary who still answers the phone by saying the full firm name. Gregory is about my age, bald and allergic to small talk, which is why I like him. "Harold," he said, standing up from behind his desk, "I was going to call you next week. I'm sorry I didn't make it to the service. I was in Columbia for a hearing." "Don't apologize. Sit down. I need to go through the trust." He pulled the file. The Revocable Living Trust my wife and I had finalized in 2021, naming me as the surviving trustee with full authority to amend, reallocate, and redirect distributions to any beneficiary during my lifetime. Total current value as of last quarter's statement, $3,140,000. House on Trad Street, a rental property on Sullivan's Island, a brokerage account, 2 CDs, and what was left of the proceeds from selling the freight company. "You can do whatever you want, Harold," Gregory said. "That's the whole point of a revocable trust. Who'd you have in mind?" I didn't answer right away. I looked out his window at the palmetto tree across Broad Street. "Nobody yet," I said. "I want to understand what I'm working with first. Before I change a single comma, I want to know exactly who my family is." Gregory studied me for a second. Then he gave a small nod, like he understood more than I'd said out loud. "Take your time," he said. "When you know what you want, I'll have it drafted in 48 hours. I drove home the long way, down East Bay and past the Battery, watching the gulls over the harbor. I was eating a sandwich at my kitchen table when the phone rang. It was Brittany. Her voice was dripping with a kind of sweetness I had never once heard from her in 10 years of marriage to my son. "Harold, I just wanted to check on you. I've been so worried. Andrew and I talked, and we'd love to have you over for Sunday lunch. Please, it's important for the family to stay close right now." I watched the second hand on the kitchen clock make a full revolution before I answered. "Sunday," I said. "That sounds fine." I hung up, and I actually laughed out loud, one sharp bark of a laugh in my empty kitchen. It had taken her less than 4 days from the graveside insult to inviting the old man over for lunch. Something had shifted. Somebody had told her something, or she'd gotten impatient, or she'd overplayed her hand at the funeral and realized she needed to course correct. I didn't know which yet, but I was going to find out over chicken and potatoes. Sunday came. Their house in Mount Pleasant is one of those beige new builds, with columns that support nothing and a lawn that's mostly decorative gravel. Brittany had set the table with what I'm pretty sure was my wife's silver pattern, though she'd never been given any of it. I'd have asked him, but that wasn't what I was there to do. Her sister Tiffany was there too. Tiffany is 36, works for an insurance company, and has the same thin-pressed smile as Brittany, but with less makeup and worse timing. I hadn't known she'd be joining us. Andrew kept refilling my iced tea like a nervous waiter. Around the main course, Brittany excused herself to the kitchen to get the bread. Tiffany followed a minute later. I waited about 40 seconds, then stood up quietly and walked down the hall toward the powder room, which happens to share a wall with the kitchen. Thin drywall, new construction. Brittany's voice, low and clipped. "Stop worrying. The old man's going to last 6 months, tops. Grief kills men his age faster than cancer. We just need to get him to sign the power of attorney before Christmas. Then we can move everything before Andrew's brother figures out what's happening." Tiffany murmured something I couldn't catch. "I'll handle Andrew," Brittany said. "Just make sure the paperwork on Mom's side stays clean for a few more months." I stood in that hallway with one hand flat against the wall, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, something colder, something clearer. It was the same feeling I used to get 30 years ago when a shipper lied to me about a manifest, and I knew exactly which container to open first. I walked back to the dining room, sat down, smiled at my son, and asked him to pass the butter. Somewhere between the butter dish and the dessert plate, the old man they thought they were burying decided he wasn't going anywhere. Not for a long, long time. The Monday after that Sunday lunch, I did something I had never done in my life. I drove up to North Charleston to a squat brick office building next to a tire shop, and I walked into the office of a licensed private investigator named Ernest Herrera. Ernest is about 50, built like a retired shortstop, and has the kind of quiet face that doesn't react to anything. His office smelled like old coffee and printer toner. I sat across his desk, slid over a copy of my wife's handwritten note, and told him what I'd overheard through the drywall in Mount Pleasant. "Let me be clear about what I want," I said. "I'm not asking you to break any law. I'm not asking for wiretaps or a parked van on their street. I want public records, property, credit filings, court documents. I want to know what my daughter-in-law's mother owned when she died, what happened to it, and what my daughter-in-law's sister has been signing her name to at that insurance company she works for." Ernest wrote 3 things on a legal pad, underlined one, and quoted me $3,500 for the first phase. I wrote the check without blinking. "Give me 2 weeks," he said. Driving back down I-26 that afternoon, I caught myself almost smiling. I hadn't felt this clear-headed in months. My wife used to say I got twitchy when I wasn't working on a problem. Grief was a problem I couldn't fix. Brittany was a problem I could. That evening I went to my model club out at the community center in Mount Pleasant. About 12 of us meet every Tuesday and Thursday, mostly retired men, a couple of widows. I've been a member for 9 years. The club president is a woman named Dolores, who used to teach shop at the high school, and can solder better than anyone I've ever seen. I'd been avoiding the club since the funeral. That night, I walked in with a wooden box under my arm containing the pieces of an 1890 brass sextant I'd picked up at an estate sale 2 summers ago and never had time for. It was in rough shape. Green corrosion on the index arm, a cracked horizon mirror, the vernier scale barely readable. Dolores raised her eyebrows when I set it down. "Harold, that's a beast of a project." "I need a beast," I said. I worked on that sextant for 4 hours straight. Cleaning, labeling parts, photographing the assembly. It quieted something in my chest. When I got home, close to midnight, there were 7 missed calls from Andrew on my phone. I let him sit until the next afternoon. He showed up at the Trad Street house without warning, with a man in a cheap gray suit carrying a leather portfolio. Andrew introduced him as a mobile notary he'd found online. I'll admit, I almost laughed out loud at the nerve of it. "Dad," Andrew said, sitting on my living room sofa like a nervous salesman, "Brittany and I have been really worried. Mom's death hit you hard. What if something happens? A fall, a stroke, anything. You'd want someone to be able to handle the bills, right? Keep the house running?" He slid a document across the coffee table. "Durable power of attorney. broad as the Charleston harbor. It would have given him authority over my bank accounts, real estate, investments, everything except my dental floss. I put on my reading glasses slowly. I took my time. I read every paragraph the way I used to read bills of lading. Then I folded my hands and looked at my son. "Andrew," I said, "that's very thoughtful. You and Brittany obviously lost sleep over this. Let me sit with it for a few days. I want to run it by my lawyer. You understand? A man my age should be careful about what he signs, don't you think?" His jaw did that little tightening thing again. The notary, who clearly hadn't been briefed on what was actually happening, just sat there shuffling his papers. "Of course, Dad. Of course. Take your time. Just, don't take too long. These things matter." They left. I poured myself a cup of coffee. I took a long breath. And I laughed quietly in my own kitchen for the second time in a week. The next morning I drove downtown and put a copy of the document on Gregory Marshall's desk. He read it twice. "Harold," he said, and there was actual heat in his voice, which for Gregory is an earthquake. "If you had signed this, they would have moved half of your liquid assets in 30 days. This language is about as narrow as the Atlantic Ocean. Whoever drafted this knew exactly what they were doing, and they were not trying to protect your dental appointments." I drove home feeling oddly calm. I sat down on my porch with a glass of sweet tea and watched an oyster boat pull into the harbor. The phone rang around 4 in the afternoon. Ernest Herrera. His voice had a tightness I hadn't heard the first time we met. "Mr. Bishop, you need to come up here. I've got something you're not going to believe. Your daughter-in-law's mother, Deborah Crawford, died almost 3 years ago, and her Social Security benefits are still being deposited every single month." I drove up to North Charleston the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee. Ernest had a brown accordion folder on his desk, thick as a phone book, and a face that told me he had worked late and enjoyed it. "Sit down, Mr. Bishop. I'll walk you through what I've got." He laid it out like a man who'd done this before. Deborah Crawford, Brittany's mother, passed away in a hospice in Somerville almost 3 years ago. Cause of death: complications from a long illness. The death was registered with the state of South Carolina. It was never reported to the Social Security Administration. Every single month since $2,180 had been deposited into a joint checking account that Deborah and Brittany had opened together back in 2018. 38 months, $82,840. "Federal violation," Ernest said, tapping one finger on the folder. "Title 42, United States Code, Section 408. They take this seriously. It's not a parking ticket." I looked at the photocopied bank statements, withdrawal after withdrawal, Brittany's signature on every one. "And the sister?" I said. "Tiffany." Ernest pulled out a second folder. "Tiffany Crawford, 36, works at a regional insurance office off Savannah Highway. Last year, she signed a dependent declaration for a supplemental policy on her late mother, claiming Deborah as a dependent still alive and residing at Tiffany's address. False statement, fresh ink, insurance fraud on top of federal benefits fraud." I sat in that office for another 20 minutes while Ernest walked me through every document. When I stood up to leave, I wrote him a second check and told him to start certified copies of everything, notarized, time-stamped, with chain of custody. I wanted every page sealed so tight that no paper shredder in Mount Pleasant could ever catch up. "I'm not taking this to law enforcement," I told him. "Not yet." Ernest raised one eyebrow. "Your call. I want her to walk herself into this. The minute I report it, she disappears behind lawyers. Right now she thinks I'm a sad old widower who signs whatever he's handed. I want to keep her thinking that as long as possible." He almost smiled. "Understood." That afternoon I sat in Gregory Marshall's office with the folder between us. Gregory thumbed through it, making those small clicking sounds he makes when he's concentrating. "Harold," he said finally, "everything in here is already a crime. Completed. Documented. You don't need to do anything to it. You just need to decide when to light the match." "I want options," I said. "Civil leverage. Legal pressure. What can the trust do, cleanly, that makes them come to me on their knees before anything federal ever hits their door?" Gregory leaned back. He listed 3 tools. I won't repeat them here because I hadn't decided yet which one I'd use first. I took notes in the small leather notebook I've carried since I ran the freight company. I left his office with a plan starting to take shape. Not a revenge fantasy, a business operation. Phases, triggers, fallbacks. That weekend, my older son William drove down from Norfolk with his 2 kids. Henry, who's 12 and reads more books than most adults, and Clara, who's 9 and talks to the cat on my porch like it owes her money. William is the son I don't have to worry about. He served 8 years, came out with a clean head and a good wife, and now does civil engineering work on bridge retrofits. Saturday afternoon, Henry climbed onto the porch swing next to me and pulled a folded piece of paper out of his jacket. "I drew this for you, Grandpa." It was a sailboat. Careful lines, the rigging in the right places, a tiny flag I think was meant to be South Carolina. I unfolded it on my knee, and I didn't say anything for a minute because I was afraid my voice was going to do something I didn't want it to do. "That's a beautiful ship, son," I said. "I'm going to put it in a frame." Dad says you fix old compasses. I do. Can you teach me? Yes, I can. William stayed until Sunday evening. He didn't ask about the funeral. He didn't ask about his brother. He just cooked me a proper dinner, helped me move a heavy bookcase, and told his kids the story of how their grandmother once outbid a man from Atlanta on a grandfather clock at an auction by pretending to be half asleep. Monday morning, the house felt different, cleaner. I was in the middle of polishing a brass part from the sextant at the kitchen table when my phone buzzed with a news alert I hadn't set. I dismissed it. Across the harbor, in a corner office at a bank on Meeting Street, Brittany was having an unexpected conversation. I only learned about it later from Ernest, who had a contact there. A loan officer Brittany sometimes flirted with for faster service had mentioned, in casual sympathy, "I saw Mr. Bishop's trust documents came in for review last week. He's got quite a bit of movement in there. I'm so sorry about his wife." Brittany didn't react in the lobby. She thanked the man, walked to her car, sat behind the wheel, and checked her face in the rearview mirror. Her lipstick was perfect. Her eyes were not. And right there, in that parking lot, her smile changed. It got thinner. It got hungrier. She had been guessing about the size of what I was sitting on. Now she knew there was something worth fighting for. She picked up her phone and made 2 calls. The first was to her sister. The second was to my son. And that's the exact moment I understood how I was going to repay them. 3 days after Brittany's little parking lot revelation, she showed up on my porch carrying a pecan pie in a glass dish, a bouquet of white lilies, and an expression so carefully assembled I almost complimented her on the stitching. "Harold," she said, her bottom lip trembling on cue, "I haven't been able to eat. I haven't slept. What I said at the cemetery? I don't even recognize the woman who said that. It was shock. It was grief. Please, please let me come in." I held the door open. I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I just stepped aside like a man letting in the plumber. She set the pie on my kitchen counter, and for the next 40 minutes, she performed. That's the only word for it. She cried real tears twice. I'll grant her that. She had some kind of technique, and told me how much she'd always admired me, how much she'd learned from my late wife, how family was the only thing that mattered now, and how she wanted to start over. She used the word family 11 times. I counted. I poured her a cup of coffee, let her talk, and offered nothing back except the occasional "I see" and "I understand." At one point I caught my reflection in the microwave door, a quiet old man listening politely, and I thought, if she only knew what kind of folder was sitting in a safe deposit box on Broad Street, right now she'd be choking on that pie instead of slicing it. When she left, she hugged me. The second fake hug in a month. I kept my hands at my sides. The next evening, Andrew called. His voice was doing that thing where he tries to sound breezy and ends up sounding like a man trying to lift a refrigerator, one-handed. "Dad, listen. Brittany and I want to take you out. Somewhere nice. Husk. Queen Street. Saturday night. Our treat completely. Just the 3 of us. It's been too long since we had a real family meal." "That sounds nice, son." "Dad, we want things to be good again." "I know you do." I hung up. I sat in my reading chair. I looked out at the harbor, and I thought about that note in my wife's handwriting. And I thought about a Thursday evening at the Model Club where I had finished reassembling the vernier scale on the sextant with my own 2 hands. I was not weak. I was not confused. I was, in fact, paying more attention than I had in years. Saturday came. I put on a clean shirt and a navy blazer and drove myself to Queen Street. The restaurant was packed, candles on every table. Brittany had on pearls I'd never seen before. I wondered briefly whose account had paid for those. And Andrew was already halfway through a bourbon when I sat down. The appetizers came: pimento cheese, cornbread, shrimp. Brittany waited until the plates were arranged, leaned forward across the table, and placed one manicured hand on my wrist, like we were about to be photographed for a charity brochure. Harold, I have to say this in person. The things I said at the funeral, I will carry that shame with me for the rest of my life. I was wrong. Please, from the bottom of my heart, forgive me. We are your only family. We want to take care of you. Let us take care of you. Andrew nodded seriously next to her, like a man affirming a pledge of allegiance. I let the silence sit for about 5 seconds, long enough to hear the couple at the next table laugh, long enough that Brittany's hand started to feel damp on my wrist. Then I gently moved my arm, picked up my water glass, took a sip, and set it down. Brittany, I said, at a volume just a hair louder than polite conversation, you made 2 mistakes. The first was when you thought I was dying. The second was when you thought I hadn't noticed. The sound at our table died. The waitress, who had just appeared with a tray of entrees, froze 3 feet away, the plates hovering. Brittany's mouth opened and nothing came out. A small pink blotch appeared on her left cheekbone and started spreading like a stain. Andrew, I watched in real time, turned the color of a ripe tomato from the collar up. His bourbon glass clinked against his teeth as he tried to hide behind it. I picked up my napkin, folded it neatly, and laid it on the table. The pimento cheese is excellent, I said to the waitress. You can set those down. I'll only be another minute. I stood up. I left $300 on the table, more than covered my share of the appetizer, and walked out of Husk. The cool November air on Queen Street hit me like a cold towel, and for the first time since the cemetery, I walked with my shoulders back. From the sidewalk, through the window, I saw Brittany stand up abruptly, knocking over her water glass. She grabbed her phone and half stumbled toward the restroom hallway. I couldn't hear her, of course. I didn't need to. Ernest Herrera called me the next morning and told me he had it anyway. A source at the bank had flagged 3 emergency wire transfers, initiated that same night from the joint account Brittany shared with her dead mother. Her first call after Husk had been to her sister Tiffany. The second was to someone in the Bahamas who never picked up. I smiled into my coffee. They had started running, which meant they had started leaving tracks. The week after Husk, Brittany and Tiffany ran themselves ragged, trying to clean up something that had already been photographed, notarized, and sealed 3 weeks earlier. I watched from the porch on Trad Street like a man watching 2 raccoons try to put a trash can lid back on after the trash is already in the yard. Ernest's people tracked it all without touching a thing. The sisters closed the joint account their mother's benefits had been flowing into. They opened a new one at a different bank. They tried to redirect the monthly deposit to an LLC Tiffany had set up. What they didn't know was that every statement, every signature, every transfer slip from the past 3 years had already been stamped, certified, and locked into 3 separate locations. One at Ernest's office, one in a safe deposit box at South State Bank on Broad Street, one in a sealed package in Gregory Marshall's personal vault. They were erasing footprints on wet cement that had dried 2 months ago. Meanwhile, I was in an office on East Bay Street, meeting Linda Vaughn for the first time. Linda is a certified financial planner, probably mid-40s, sharp as a scalpel, recommended by Gregory after he and I agreed the original revocable living trust needed to become something a lot harder to touch. She sat across from me with 3 laptops open and a notebook, and she didn't waste 1 minute of my afternoon. "Mr. Bishop," she said, "based on the asset list your attorney sent over, we can build an irrevocable trust within 10 business days. Principal funding of $2,800,000. Primary beneficiaries your son William and your grandchildren Henry and Clara. Distributions structured as education trusts for the grandchildren until age 30, with a hardship clause you can customize. Your son Andrew can be listed as a residual beneficiary for $50,000. Symbolic. Is that the direction?" "That's exactly the direction. Once we execute You cannot undo this. That's the whole point of irrevocable. It's also why it can't be touched by creditors, litigants, or family members claiming undue influence. I understand. Gregory Marshall had the paperwork drafted inside 48 hours. I read every page. I signed where I was supposed to sign. I initialed where I was supposed to initial. Linda notarized with a witness. The whole thing took 90 minutes at a conference table overlooking a small courtyard where a magnolia tree was losing the last of its leaves. When I walked out of that office, $2,800,000 of my life's work was locked in a legal structure that Brittany, Andrew, and every lawyer they could afford between them could not pry open with dynamite. I drove home through the evening traffic, almost whistling. 3 days later, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. It was Linda's notary, a young man named Trevor, who had been at the signing. His voice was tight. "Mr. Bishop, I just got a call from a court clerk friend. Someone filed a petition this morning in Charleston County Probate Court. Conservatorship, over you. The petitioner is your son, Andrew Bishop." I sat on the edge of my bed. I actually laughed out loud. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh you do when a man you've known his whole life does exactly the stupid, predictable thing you thought he'd do. Andrew, poor Andrew, was trying to have me declared legally incompetent. Dementia, diminished capacity after the funeral, the works. If he won, a court-appointed conservator would take over my finances, freeze my trust activity, and possibly unwind the irrevocable I had just signed. If he won. I made 2 phone calls. First to Gregory, who said, and I'm quoting, "Harold, that's the stupidest possible move he could have made, and I am going to enjoy dismantling this in open court." Second to the main switchboard at the Medical University of South Carolina, where I scheduled myself a full, voluntary, independent neuropsychological evaluation for that same week. I paid out of pocket. I wanted no insurance trail, no question of bias, no anything. The evaluation took 4 hours. A neurologist, a clinical psychologist, a battery of cognitive tests I won't pretend I enjoyed. They asked me to remember word lists, draw clock faces, solve puzzles that made my head feel hot, describe abstract paintings, do mental arithmetic without a pencil. At one point, I had to name as many animals as I could in 60 seconds. I got to 43. The psychologist raised an eyebrow like I'd done something unusual. 3 days later, the written report arrived in a sealed envelope at Gregory's office. He called me and read the conclusion out loud over the phone, and I could hear the smile in his voice, even though Gregory doesn't really smile. Full cognitive competence across all measured domains. No indication of dementia, cognitive decline, or diminished capacity. Estimated full-scale IQ, 128. Signed and sealed by Dr. Maida, Department of Neurology, MUSC. I set the phone down. I walked to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of sweet tea, and I thought about the look that would be on Andrew's face in that courtroom when his own lawyer had to read those numbers out loud to a judge. I thought about Brittany sitting behind him, trying to keep her mouth from doing the thing it did at Husk. I thought about how a man can spend 38 years underestimating his own father, and then, in one bad week, find out the bill for all those years was about to come due, in full, with interest. I took my sweet tea out to the porch. I sat down, and I waited. The hearing was set for a Wednesday morning at the Charleston County Probate Court, a brick and limestone building off Broad Street that I'd walked past 1,000 times, and never once expected to enter as an alleged incompetent. I wore the navy suit my wife bought me for our 40th anniversary. Gregory Marshall met me in the lobby with a leather briefcase stuffed so tight the latches strained. He gave me one look up and down, nodded once, and said, "You're going to enjoy this, Harold." We walked into courtroom 2B. Andrew was already seated at the petitioner's table with a young attorney in a cheap blue tie who was, I could see from the doorway, sweating. Brittany sat in the second row of the gallery in a gray dress that was probably meant to look modest, and instead looked like a costume. Tiffany was 2 seats over, pretending to read something on her phone. Andrew wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes on a yellow legal pad and scribbled nothing on it over and over. The judge was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the patient, unamused face of someone who had been doing this for 20 years and could smell a bad petition from the parking lot. Her name was Judge Harriet Foster. Andrew's attorney stood up and started his pitch. My son's own father, recent widower, showing clear signs of cognitive deterioration, vulnerability to undue influence, erratic financial decisions. He mentioned a recent restructuring of significant assets, meaning the irrevocable trust, as evidence I was being manipulated by outside parties. He did not name the outside parties because he did not have any. Then Gregory stood up. Gregory did not give a speech. Gregory handed the clerk 3 things. First, the sealed MUSC neuropsychological report, signed by Dr. Mehta, showing full cognitive competence across every measured domain and a full-scale IQ of 128. Second, a sworn affidavit from Dolores Pratt, president of the Charleston Harbor Model Club, describing in technical detail the work I had just completed on an 1890 brass sextant, disassembly, mirror replacement, calibration of the Vernier scale, precision to within a fraction of a degree. Third, a 12-month printout of my bank activity, showing not a single unusual withdrawal, not one missed bill, not one irregularity. Judge Foster read the MUSC cover page, looked up over her reading glasses at Andrew, and said, "Counselor, does your client wish to withdraw this petition before I rule on it?" Andrew's attorney leaned toward him and whispered. Andrew shook his head no, probably because Brittany had told him in the car never to back down. Judge Foster took exactly 40 minutes. She denied the petition in full, made a brief comment on the court record about petitions that waste the resources of this court and the dignity of the respondent, and ordered Andrew to pay all associated court costs, $14,600. $14,600. I watched Andrew's face when that number hit. He didn't so much turn pale as lose the idea of blood altogether. His lawyer packed up like a man who had just realized he wasn't going to get his full retainer. I walked out of that courtroom with Gregory beside me and my head up. In the marble hallway, Brittany caught up to me. She didn't shout. She came close, put her face 6 inches from mine, and hissed through her teeth. "You're going to regret every bit of this, Harold." I stopped walking. I turned to face her. The hallway had enough people in it, a bailiff, 2 attorneys, a security guard, that she had to keep her voice low, but her eyes were doing something I'd never seen them do before. Pupils wide, jaw clamped, a small vein working on the side of her throat. I smiled politely. I waited a beat. "No, Brittany," I said. "You will." "And in writing?" Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. She had no idea what I meant. She turned on her heel and walked away fast, heels clicking across the marble like a woman being chased by something she couldn't see. That same evening, Gregory sent a certified package, by courier, to the Mount Pleasant address. He also mailed a copy through regular mail for documentation. Every personal loan I had extended to my son over the past 5 years, every bridge for his stalled businesses, every just until the closing on a Brittany investment scheme, every Christmas gift he had insisted on treating as a loan on paper so he could write it off later, totaling $127,000 had, at the time of each transaction, been quietly documented as a formal promissory note. My wife had insisted. Gregory had drafted everyone. Andrew had signed everyone because he'd been too eager to get the check to read the fine print. The letter from the trust, on official letterhead, gave him 60 days to pay the full balance, all $127,000, principal and accrued interest at the statutory rate. Gregory's paralegal called me from her car when she confirmed the delivery. She said the front porch light came on, a man opened the door in sweatpants, and she watched him sit down on the top step and read the first page twice without turning the page. And that's where the letter was when my son's kitchen light finally went on that night, around 11:30. Face up on the granite island, with a glass of bourbon sweating a ring onto the envelope, and Brittany standing over it in her bathrobe, reading it for the 3rd time. Brittany did not handle that letter quietly. Within 48 hours, her voice was everywhere. She called me at home 4 times, left 2 voicemails so rehearsed I could hear her reading them from a notepad. She told 2 different cousins of mine that I was having a breakdown. She cornered a neighbor from Trad Street at the grocery store and spun a 15-minute monologue about how grief was destroying poor Harold. I stopped answering unknown numbers and let Gregory handle everything in writing. The 60-day clock on the promissory notes started ticking. Andrew and Brittany had none of that money. They'd spent the last few years spending tomorrow's income and pretending tomorrow wasn't coming. Ernest Herrera, who I kept on retainer because why stop now, sent me a quiet update. Their house in Mount Pleasant was not only mortgaged, it was mortgaged a second time through a home equity line taken out 18 months earlier to cover renovations that had never happened. The money had gone to a boat Andrew didn't own anymore, and a private investment fund Brittany had poured $38,000 into and written off. The first solid counterattack came from Brittany. She hired a new attorney, a flashy one with a billboard on Interstate 26, and filed what she called a tortious interference claim against Gregory, alleging that my attorney had unduly influenced an elderly client. Gregory read the filing, laughed for a full 30 seconds, the only time I've ever heard the man actually laugh, and filed a motion to dismiss the same afternoon. The court dismissed it within 10 days and ordered Brittany to pay Gregory's filing costs, another $3,400 she didn't have. Then Andrew did something I almost respected. He drove up to Norfolk to see his brother William. I found out the next morning. William called me from his kitchen. His voice had that calm, flat tone he uses when he's annoyed and trying not to be. "Dad, Andy showed up last night, unannounced, crying, asked for $130,000. Said Brittany would pay me back with interest once they sold the house." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I love him and I can't help him. I also told him Brittany is the reason we haven't had a real conversation in 6 years, and that until he sees that clearly, nothing I could give him would help. Then I made him a sandwich and sent him home." I sat down slowly in my reading chair. That was the most my older son had said about his brother in a long time. "Are you all right, William?" "I'm fine, Dad. Henry wants to come down next weekend and work on that sextant with you. Is that okay?" "That's more than okay." Meanwhile, Brittany started selling things. Her jewelry went first. I heard about it from Dolores at the Model Club, whose niece worked at a high-end consignment shop on King Street. A tennis bracelet, 2 pairs of earrings, a diamond solitaire that had been an anniversary gift from Andrew several years back, bought with money I had technically lent him. The consignment shop gave her about $18,000 for items that had cost $60. She took the check and did not thank the clerk. That was my window. I drove up to North Charleston one morning and sat down in Ernest's office. He had his coffee, I had mine. I slid a sealed envelope across the desk. "Ernest, time to close the circle. I want anonymous tips filed. 1 to the Social Security Administration Office of the Inspector General, Charleston Field Office. 1 to the South Carolina Department of Insurance. The SSA tip references the Deborah Crawford file. 3 years of undisclosed death. 38 months of continued benefits, every bank record and signature on file. The insurance tip references Tiffany Crawford's false dependent declaration. Both tips should be completely clean. No names, no return address, just facts and document references, so specific they can't be ignored." Ernest picked up the envelope, weighed it in his hand, and nodded. "Consider it handled. Give it a week or 2 to filter through the system." It took about 3 weeks. One Thursday morning, 2 federal agents from the SSA Office of the Inspector General walked into the lobby of Tiffany Crawford's insurance office on Savannah Highway, politely asked to speak with her in a conference room, and placed a preservation letter on the table along with a list of 12 specific questions. Tiffany, according to a secretary Ernest knew, came out of that conference room an hour later, looking like she had been physically drained of color. She left work early and did not come back the next day. 7 days after that, a second pair of agents knocked on the front door of the house in Mount Pleasant. Brittany opened it in yoga clothes. They identified themselves. They did not raise their voices. They asked her to come outside and speak with them for a few minutes. The neighbors saw everything from their porches. That same evening, a cold rain was falling sideways across Trad Street when my doorbell rang. I opened the door. Brittany was standing on my welcome mat in heels and a soaked cashmere coat, mascara running in 2 black tracks down her face. She did not ask to come in. She sank, slowly, one knee and then the other, onto my front porch, in front of the wet address numbers, and she said in a voice I had never heard her use in 10 years, "Harold, please, I'm begging you. Tell them this is a mistake. We'll give everything back. I will do anything. Please." I stood in my doorway for a long moment. The cold air moved past her into my hallway. A horse carriage passed somewhere down the street. I stepped aside. Brittany walked into my hallway on unsteady heels, and for the first time in 10 years of knowing her, she looked smaller than she was. The cashmere coat hung off her like wet laundry. Her hair clung to her cheeks. Her mascara had not just run. It had pooled under her jaw in 2 dark commas. Andrew was behind her, silent, pale, his hands pushed so deep into the pockets of his jacket that the seams stretched. He wouldn't meet my eye. He looked at the floorboards, at the umbrella stand, at the ceiling, anywhere but at my face. I didn't offer them seats. I didn't offer them a towel. I walked into the front parlor, turned on a single brass lamp on the side table, and stood beside the old oak secretary desk that had belonged to my grandfather. The rain outside was loud enough that the gutters were complaining. Brittany started talking before she was fully in the room. Words tumbled out of her in a long, unbroken stream. She would sign anything. She would publicly apologize. A letter in the paper, a video, whatever I wanted. She would move. She would leave Charleston, leave South Carolina, take Andrew with her, or leave him if I preferred. She would pay back every cent of the Social Security money with interest. She had been under stress. She had been drinking too much. Her mother's death had broken something in her. She loved my late wife. She swore she did. She had just been confused that day at the cemetery. She could fix this. She could fix all of it. She just needed a chance. One chance. One phone call from me to the federal office, and this could all disappear. She was 34 years old. She couldn't do probation. She couldn't have a record. She had a career. She had plans. She had a life. I let her go. I didn't interrupt once. I watched her face while she talked. The mascara tracks. The bottom lip that wouldn't stay still. The little catch in her throat every time she said the word, please. When she finally ran out of air, the room went quiet, except for the rain hitting the wrought iron balcony outside. I waited a full count of 5. Then I opened the middle drawer of the secretary desk and took out a brown leather folder. I set it down on the mahogany tabletop between us. I flipped it open. I laid each item out like a dealer fanning cards. First, the executed irrevocable trust documents, stamped and filed, naming William, Henry, and Clara as primary beneficiaries. Irrevocable means what the word says. Not even I could touch them now. Second, Ernest Herrera's reports, the certified bank statements, the death certificate, the 38 months of undisclosed deposits, the transaction trail, Brittany's signatures in photocopied rows, 1 per page. Third, the printed confirmations from the 2 federal tip lines, the intake numbers, the active case references for the SSA Office of the Inspector General, and the South Carolina Department of Insurance. And last, I laid it down separately to the side of the others on its own, a folded piece of paper, softened by months of being read and refolded, my wife's handwriting. Check Brittany's mother's accounts. Something is wrong. Brittany stared at the note. She did not reach for it. I watched her understand, piece by piece, what she was looking at. Her breathing changed. The hand that had been on her chest dropped to her side. Her knees locked. Her eyes stopped moving. I waited until she looked up at me. "Eleanor knew," I said. I kept my voice even. I did not raise it. "She left me this note 3 days before she died. You stood over the grave of a woman who had already seen right through you. And you laughed. I only had to finish what she started." I let that sit for a moment. "There are no deals tonight, Brittany. The trust goes to the grandchildren who knew her name. You will go wherever the courts decide to send you, because the line you were putting me in, that was never my line. That was always yours, and you are already standing in it." Her face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. Not one emotion, but a collapse of about 6 of them in a row. Shock, first. Her eyebrows lifted and held. Then a flash of something like rage, which she choked back so fast her jaw audibly clicked. Then disbelief. She actually shook her head slowly, as if she could physically dislodge what she was seeing. then a kind of hollow understanding that drained her face of its last color. Her jaw moved, but no words came out. She reached one trembling hand toward the folder, touched the edge of the SSL case number with the tip of one finger, and pulled her fingers back as if the paper were hot. Her shoulders rose once, twice, in shallow little gasps. The confident realtor, the woman who had hissed at me in a marble hallway 3 weeks earlier, the woman who had rehearsed an apology over a pecan pie. None of those women were standing in my parlor anymore. What was left was a woman in a wet coat who had just realized every move she'd made since October had been watched and filed. Andrew made a small sound behind her. Not a word, just a sound. Brittany turned around slowly. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at me again. She walked out of my parlor, past the coat stand, and pushed through the front door into the rain. The door swung half shut behind her. Andrew stood in the open doorway for a long moment. The rain hit the threshold and pooled on the wood. He stared at the floor. When he finally raised his head, his eyes were wet, but his mouth was quiet. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. It was barely louder than a whisper. I looked at my son. I looked at the 38-year-old man who had followed Brittany to my kitchen door that first Sunday, who had nodded along at Husk, who had filed a petition to have his own father declared incompetent. And I saw, for maybe the first time in 5 years, the boy who had cried at my wife's dining table. I nodded, one small nod. I did not speak. Then I closed the door. The federal charges came down about 2 weeks later. Brittany Bishop and Tiffany Crawford were indicted for Social Security, fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The 3 charges stacked the way federal prosecutors stack them when they want a defendant to take a deal before trial. Brittany's flashy new attorney lasted about 1 meeting before telling her she couldn't afford his fee anymore. A public defender took over. Within 10 days, she had signed a plea agreement. Restitution of the full $82,840. An additional $40,000 fine. 18 months of federal probation. 300 hours of community service, which a judge assigned to a food bank in North Charleston. And the part she couldn't buy her way out of, a permanent entry in her federal criminal record that she would carry from her 30s into her grave. Tiffany got 24 months of federal probation and permanent revocation of her insurance license. She moved back in with an aunt in Columbia and started over as a receptionist. Andrew's collapse was quieter. He couldn't pay the promissory notes. He couldn't pay the $14,600 court judgment. He couldn't refinance the twice-mortgaged house. He filed Chapter 7 personal bankruptcy in the federal district court, surrendered the house in Mount Pleasant, and moved alone into a small rental apartment north of the crosstown. He and Brittany did not file for divorce, but they did not live in the same place anymore, and Ernest told me they hadn't spoken in 6 weeks. I signed no papers of forgiveness. I made no public statements. I did not call. I did not write. William drove down from Norfolk the weekend after the plea was announced, with Henry and Clara, and a cooler full of sandwiches for the road. They came through my front door loud and laughing, and the Trad Street house felt like a house again. I had something I had been waiting to give my grandson. I took Henry into the study and handed him a small wooden box. Inside, on a bed of dark velvet, was the 1890 brass sextant, fully restored, every mirror replaced, every arc polished, the vernier scale readable again. Next to it, wrapped in a soft cloth, was the small brass compass I had held at the cemetery, the one my wife had carried in her bag for 30 years. "The compass is yours now, son," I said. "Your grandmother carried it longer than I've known you. She said it always told the truth, even when the people around her didn't. I think she'd want you to have it." Henry held the compass with both hands. He's 12. He doesn't cry easily. He didn't cry that day either. But he pressed it against his chest like he understood exactly what I had given him. Clara, 9 years old, climbed into my lap on the porch that afternoon and asked me to tell her a story about her grandmother. I told her about an auction in Mount Pleasant many years ago where her grandmother had pretended to fall asleep in the second row so that a man from Atlanta would stop bidding against her on a grandfather clock. I told her how she read people better than anyone I'd ever met. I told her the story of a note folded up in a pocket that caught a cheat 3 days after it was written. Clara listened, and nodded like all of that was perfectly obvious, the way children can sometimes understand the adult world better than the adults do. The final afternoon of that month, after William and the kids had driven back up to Norfolk, I sat on my porch on Trad Street and watched the light change over the harbor. The air was cool, but the worst of winter had passed. A sailboat tacked in the channel. The palmetto across the street moved gently. On my porch table sat two things: a new sextant project I had picked up at the same estate sale the old one had come from, in worse shape than the first, which was exactly why I wanted it, and a sealed envelope from Gregory Marshall that had arrived that morning. I picked it up, broke the seal, and read the single-page letter inside. Harold, final filings complete. Trust executed, funded, and recorded. Henry and Clara named as primary beneficiaries, as instructed. All documentation in order. Nothing further required from you. Respectfully, Gregory. I set the letter down on the table. I looked out at the harbor, and for the first time since a cold October morning at Magnolia Cemetery, I smiled. Not a sharp smile, not a satisfied smile. A real one, the kind you give to a view you intend to keep looking at for a long time. The brass of the new sextant caught the last of the afternoon sun. My wife's compass sat on the mantelpiece inside, safe in the hands of the next bishop to know how to read it. Somewhere in Mount Pleasant, a house I had never liked was being listed for sale. Somewhere in Columbia, a woman was answering a phone for the first time as someone who no longer held an insurance license. Somewhere north of the crosstown, a son was sitting in a small rented kitchen, and maybe, just maybe, he was starting the slow work of becoming a man again. None of it was my problem anymore. I picked up a cotton rag, opened my toolbox, and started cleaning the first part of the new sextant. The porch swing creaked. A pelican glided past over the rooftops. The house was quiet, in the way a house is quiet when the right people finally live in it. The old man they thought they were burying had a lot of afternoons like this one left, and he intended to enjoy every one of them. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.